Hi everyone, I'm David Fisher, and this is Presidential Chronicles, the series of books and videos on American history as seen through the lives of the presidents of the United States. This episode is from the life of Abraham Lincoln, and the focus is emancipation. The year is 1862. Civil War is about a year in, and Lincoln's getting some pressure to do more on this topic of slavery. Now, Lincoln had never been an abolitionist. He had said previously he had no authority or inclination to do anything about slavery in the states where it already existed. He talked about this in his inaugural address when he even agreed to support a potential constitutional amendment that would keep legal slavery in the states where it already existed. Lincoln's line in the sand was no expansion of slavery. But again, he's now a year into this war. A lot of people were thinking it was slavery and preserving the Union, obviously inextricably linked in so many minds. Why isn't he doing more? Well, Lincoln did try something, a couple of things actually. One was an economic incentive plan to try to get at least the border states, the 4 states that had slavery, that had not gone to the Confederacy, had not seceded from the Union. Would they be open to a deal of gradual emancipation in exchange for $400 per slave? Lincoln got the congressmen together from these border states and told them how much better for you and for your people to take the step which at once shortens the war and secures substantial compensation for that which is sure to be wholly lost in any other event. How much better to thus save the money which else we will sink forever in the war. Our common country is in great peril, demanding the loftiest views and boldest action to bring a speedy relief. He got no takers. Congress did take some steps along these lines. In April of 1862, they abolished the slave trade in Washington, D.C. In June of that year, they outlawed slavery in all federal territories. This was, of course, in direct conflict with the Supreme Court's decision in Dred Scott v. Sanford. And then they passed the Second Confiscation Act, which said any runaway slaves would no longer be returned, repudiating the fugitive slave law. Some of these constitutionally questionable, but Lincoln didn't have any concern. He signed them all into law. The war was not going well. Lincoln was having difficulty with the military side of things, and he was worried, and he started rethinking just about all his positions. And he first had his inclination about a widespread emancipation order in July of 1862. On July 13th, a funeral was being held for Secretary Edwin Stanton's infant son who had passed. And Lincoln confided with his other secretaries, William Seward and Gideon Wells, that he was considering the emancipation of all slaves in all the territories that were still in rebellion. Why? Out of military necessity, using his authority as commander-in-chief in a time of rebellion. Now, this was a step that he had always said he could not do. He did not have the authority to do, but things had changed, and he felt maybe he had to do it out of this military necessity. He wrote a letter to F.B. Carpenter in which he said, "Things had gone on from bad to worse until I felt that we had reached the end of our rope on the plan of operations we had been pursuing, that we had about played our last card and must change our tactics or lose the game. I now determined upon the adoption of the emancipation policy." Again, this was in July of 1862. He then pulled the full cabinet together, this is July 22nd, and said, as a fit and necessary military measure, as of July 1st, 1863, any slaves that were still held in an area that was in rebellion against the United States shall then thenceforward and forever be free. Lincoln showed a written draft in his own hand to the cabinet. He was not asking for advice. He was not asking for concurrence. A decision had already been made. The cabinet was generally supportive, but still a little bit surprised. Gideon Wells spoke for many and said, "Look, this is a very different view than we'd heard before." According to Wells, it was a new departure for the president, for until this time, in all our previous interviews, whenever the question of emancipation or the mitigation of slavery had been in any way alluded to, he had been prompt and emphatic in denouncing any interference by the general government with this subject. We had heard a little bit about this in a previous episode, but things had changed now. The war effort not going well, military necessity, forcing Abraham Lincoln, in his mind, to reverse course and take action. Now, he did not go public quite yet with this decision because Secretary Seward had a suggestion. You know what? Wait for a military victory. Then bring your Emancipation Proclamation out. You're more likely to have some success with the population. Well, in the meantime, continue to get push from the abolitionist side of the North, including Horace Greeley, who is a pretty powerful editor of the New York Tribune, who wrote an editorial on August 19th of 1862 entitled "The Prayer of 20 Million." In this, he urged Lincoln for immediate emancipation. Now, Lincoln had the draft Emancipation Proclamation in his pocket, but he didn't come forward based on Greeley's editorial. But he did respond to Greeley in a really interesting tack. Lincoln made it plain, as to the policy I seem to be pursuing, as you say, in this open letter that was published, I have not meant to leave anyone in doubt. I would save the Union. I would save it in the shortest way under the Constitution. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time save slavery, I do not agree with them. If there be those who would not save the Union unless they could at the same time destroy slavery, I do not agree with them. My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help to save the Union. Lincoln very clear. Now, he was criticized really strongly for this because there were a lot of folks who were in it to free the slaves, including civil rights advocates like Frederick Douglass, who attacked Lincoln mercilessly over this particular response. He said, "This is not what we elected you for." But Lincoln was really savvy. He knew what he was doing. He was setting the stage for something he had already planned. So now when he was about to come out with his Emancipation Proclamation, he could clearly say that this was his decision as the only way to try to save the Union. So now he had that reason, that rationale on the table, had to be going through his mind as he wrote this note, this response, this public response to Greeley's editorial. Question now is, how long would he have to wait to issue? That was up to the Union Army. Again, not going well. Confederate General Robert E. Lee had just bested Union General John Pope in the Second Battle of Bull Run. Now Lee is taking his fight to the north, crossing the river into Northern Territory in Maryland. September 3rd, he crossed the Potomac with 55,000 soldiers, concentrating near Frederick, Maryland. General George McClellan had been in charge of the soldiers near Washington, D.C., so he's the closest commander, and he sought to meet Lee, and he had 90,000 men at his disposal. The first clash took place at South Mountain, the next day at Antietam, September 17, 1862, the single bloodiest day of the war. Nearly 23,000 casualties across the two sides, including 6,500 people killed. McClellan claimed victory. Lee retreated back across the Potomac. McClellan took that as a win, but it didn't feel like much of a win to Abraham Lincoln. Lincoln visited the battlefield at Antietam. After it was over, he met with McClellan, he met with the troops. In fact, one day he rode the line in front of the troops, waving his hat to get a rousing ovation and support and morale from the men, trying to pick them up, but he was mostly somber. He was critical of McClellan. This was a lost opportunity to actually destroy Lee and his army. He said, he was walking around with one of his companions, said, "Do you know what that is?" The companion said, "It is the Army of the Potomac, I suppose." And Lincoln responded, "So it is called, but that is a mistake. It is only McClellan's bodyguard." In other words, they don't do anything the kind of general that he wanted. Well, it wasn't going to be George McClellan. And Lincoln made a couple of decisions. McClellan pretty soon was out. He was replaced by Ambrose Burnside. And Lincoln also decided to go public with the Emancipation Proclamation. The win at Antietam was a win enough for him to actually correspond to getting this out there. He met with the cabinet one more time on September the 22nd. He did not ask for any advice. He says, "This is what I'm going to do. This will go into effect in approximately 100 days, January 1st, 1863. Any slaves held in any part of the country that's still in rebellion on that date would be free." That date came, January 1st, 1863. And a lot of people were nervous. Was Lincoln going to go through with it and sign the actual proclamation? Well, even Lincoln was a little nervous. He admitted at the time to Isaac Arnold that my hand and arm trembled so violently that I could not write. I never in my life felt more certain that I was doing right than I do in signing this paper. He signed it. The Emancipation Proclamation went into effect. The reactions spanned the gamut. Now, most in the North were thrilled, and folks like Frederick Douglass spoke for many when he said that the 1st of January, 1863 was a memorable day in the progress of American liberty and civilization. It was the turning point in the conflict between freedom and slavery, and it was to be celebrated. Not everyone in the North felt this way. Many thought this was changing the purpose of the war. People had gotten involved because they wanted to save the Union. Now it was to save the Union and to free the slaves. Not all were on board with that, but none of that noise really bothered Abraham Lincoln. He was steadfast in his approach. Of course, the people in the South in the Confederacy also had a reaction to Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation, because technically all of their slaves were now freed by the President of the United States, an order which of course they completely ignored. The President of the Confederacy, Jefferson Davis, called the proclamation the most execrable measure recorded in the history of guilty man. He probably spoke for many millions in the South. A little over a year later, Lincoln was reflecting on his emancipation order when he wrote a letter to Albert Hodges, absolutely convinced in the righteousness of his act. In this letter, he said, "I did understand, however, that my oath to preserve the Constitution the best of my ability imposed upon me the duty of preserving by every indispensable means that government, that nation on which that Constitution was the organic law. Was it possible to lose the nation and yet preserve the Constitution? By general law, life and limb must be protected, yet often a limb must be amputated to save a life. But a life is never wisely given to save a limb. I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. Right or wrong, I assumed this ground and now avow it." He had disavowed this perspective up to maybe 6 to 12 months ago. Things had changed, military necessity. He used his authority as commander-in-chief in his mind for this act, and those slaves, at least on paper, had been freed. This move did have a military impact, no question about it. About 300,000 slaves escaped into the Union camps. About 100,000 of those, a little bit more, actually signed up and put on the Union Army uniform and answered the call to fight. So if you see the weakening of the Confederate military by taking away slaves and strengthening the Union Army by adding that manpower to it, clearly this had a positive impact on the war effort for the Union Army. Questionable means, perhaps, constitutionality questions based on Lincoln's own past comments, but no question on the impact, both in the short and long term, for the military side of things for Lincoln's Emancipation Proclamation. Now, none of this would mean anything without more military victories to back it up. This is now 1863. The fight goes on, and we'll cover that in more stories for another day. That is Abraham Lincoln and Emancipation from the life of Abraham Lincoln. For more presidential chronicles, check out my books on Amazon.com, and don't forget to subscribe to me on the YouTube channel. Until next time, I'm David Fisher. This is Presidential Chronicles.